Hello, Reading Room. I am Dr. Annette Feravich, and I am here on day 237, and we are here in the Reading Room on August 26th. Thanks for joining me. We are reading A Different Mirror for Young People, A History in Multicultural America by Ronald Takaki. So let me go get the book, and I will, because it's right over there, and I'll be right back to start reading. I forgot to show early birds, and I'm going to show you. And then this is sort of all three of my classes got to see the finished product of my leather bookcase. If you really want to see a nice presentation of it, I did it in early birds. But what I didn't show them in early birds, look at the straps. I made these straps, and the straps are really, really nice. I like them just as they are. Double strap, looks nice. It is practical, so it's exactly what I needed to be able to open this up, and it's stylish. But I wanted these straps to be closer together, and so I thought I would put something that was leather-like that would hold the straps together, looking nice. And so I made this. And I can put my two straps through there, and it sits on my shoulder, right? But it's really stiff, and the straps are too far apart. But anyway, I just wanted to show you that I also made that because I forgot to show them that I did make that, and I think it's really a cool idea. I just don't think I did it right. Michigan. Okay. So let's get a reading, shall we? Let's see what story we're going to read about now from Ronald Takaki. These are stories from the original that was probably not just for young people, but that had to probably be I'm just reading what was said here by Gary Okihiro, author of Pineapple Culture, A History of the Tropical and Temperate Zones. What? And this is what he says. Bursting with stories, A Different Mirror reveals U.S. history in its grand, colorful totality. What? Really? No way. Yes way. No way. All right, chapter 9. Yeah, let's not get so excited about not having the bookmark there. I did put all my bookmarks away. Chapter 9, Dealing with Indians. Let's drop this back just a little bit. One of the most significant events of the 1890s in the United States was the end of the frontier. In 1891, the U.S. Census Bureau announced that Americans had settled the entire continent and that the frontier had come to an end in 1891. 2 years later, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner published a thesis that would make him famous. Turner's thesis was titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Wonder if that's any relationship to Ted Turner or Andrew Jackson, for that matter. It is said that America and its people had been shaped by the great historic movement of advancing the frontier, which Turner called the meeting points between savagery and civilization. Does sound like Ted Turner. Ted Turner classics. Conquering the frontier had made Americans strong and self-reliant, producing a new civilization that was different from any other. These ideas supported the popular but inaccurate story that says that the United States was settled by Europeans and that Americans are white. With this view of history, it was inevitable that the Native Americans would be overcome and replaced by white Americans. The conquest of those first inhabitants was a necessary part of the taming and civilizing of the land. The official closing of the frontier in 1891, many people thought at the time, marked the triumph of civilization. An event the year before, however, had showed the tragic cost of that triumph. So we are defining civilization. Hold on just a minute. I need to get my highlighter. Oh, that was so easy, Dr. Feravich, for you to unzip those sides like that. I know. I'm so pleased. And then, with the straps on, I can fully open it. Grab my highlighter next to my beautiful pens I have. And let me highlight that. The massacre at Wounded Knee. We did read this in the book, about this in the Bookless classroom. But it's so good for me to get a different perspective, even if it is on a similar level, a little bit above. In 1889, an Indian prophet. What? We're talking about prophets in early birds. Oh my gosh. Emerged from the shores of Pyramid Lake in Nevada. He was Wovoka of Paiute. He was Wovoka of the Paiute tribe. And he called on Native Americans everywhere to perform a ceremony he called the ghost dance, wearing ghost shirts decorated with sacred symbols of blue and yellow lines. Oh. Claimed that the ghost dance would bring about the return of Indian ways, the restoration of the buffalo, and Indian control of their former lands. All Indians must dance everywhere. Keep on dancing. The game will be thick everywhere. All dead Indians will come back and live again, Wovoka said. His vision of the world without whites spread like a prairie fire through Indian country. Ghost dancing seized hold of the Sioux reservations. In the winter of 1890, a government agent at Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota told his superiors in Washington, Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy. We need protection, and we need it now. Maybe it was the Wovoka. The Indian Bureau in Washington ordered the army to arrest several Sioux leaders, including Chiefs Sitting Bull and Bigfoot. When Indian policemen arrested Sitting Bull, a scuffle broke out with his followers, and the police shot and killed the chief. Alarmed by the news, Bigfoot tried to escape with his people. When the cavalry caught them, the Indians surrendered. The soldiers took them to a camp near a frozen creek called Wounded Knee. The following morning, the Indians were ordered to turn over their weapons. Then soldiers began searching the teepees, and the situation grew tense. When a medicine man began dancing the ghost dance, a shot rang out, and suddenly the soldiers were firing on the unarmed Indians. There were only about 100 warriors, and there were nearly 500 soldiers. A survivor named Black Elk recalled, the warriors rushed to where they had piled their guns and knives. Artillery guns fired from a ridge overlooking the camp took a terrible toll on the Indians. The Those who fled from the camp were chased down by soldiers. Dead and wounded women and children and little babies were scattered all along there where they had been trying to run away. Black Elk reported. The soldiers had followed them along the gulch as they ran and murdered them there. When the guns stopped spewing their deadly fire, a terrible silence descended on the bloody scene. Hundreds of Indians lay dead or wounded on the icy ground, along with many soldiers, most of whom had been shot in the chaos by weapons fired by their own side, since the Indians had to turn over their weapons. Heavy snow began to fall. The storm passed. The soldiers threw the Indian's body into a long trench for mass burial, stripping the ghost shirts with the dancers' bodies as their souvenirs. Custer and the Frontier. Before Wounded Knee, there was the massacre at the Washita River in Oklahoma in the winter of 1868. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and 800 soldiers had been tracking a band of Cheyenne Indians when they came upon an Indian camp in the darkness. Custer ordered his men to surround it. At dawn they attacked, destroying the lodges, killing more than 100 men, and capturing more than 50 women and children. Custer and his men marched triumphantly back to their own camp, waving the scalps of the Cheyenne men and their leader, Chief Black Kettle. 8 years later, Custer, who had been promoted to general, met his own violent death at the Battle of the Little Bighorn River in the Montana Territory. Surrounded by Lakota and Cheyenne warriors of Chief Crazy Horse, Custer refused to surrender. He and all his men were killed. Custer was famous as an Indian fighter, yet he identified with the Indians in many ways. He loved the freedom of the frontier and the beauty of the western wilderness, and he wrote that if he were an Indian, he would choose the free open plains rather than the confined limits of a reservation. The reservation system. Unlike Custer, Francis A. Walker tried to avoid using armed force against the Indians. Walker was the federal government's commissioner of Indian Affairs in the 1870s. He recommended that soldiers should not surprise Indian camps at night and should not shoot down men, women, and children. Instead, he wanted the government to pursue peace by buying off the Indians to avoid violent conflict. Walker had little experience with Indians, but he had confidence in the civilizing forces of the technology and commerce. He saw that progress was bringing an end to the frontier as railways crossed the continent and Americans migrated in ever larger numbers into the Great Plains. Indians faced a grim future in this rapidly changing world. Walker felt that his mission was to save the Indians, making sure that they survived until they were ready to enter civilization. He believed in social engineering. In other words, he thought that the government should scientifically manage the welfare of Indians for their own good. So this is right here exactly what our founding fathers were going to get no matter. Social engineering. Industrial progress had cut off the Indians from their traditional ways of making a livelihood. So Walker argued the government should support them temporarily until they mastered new ways. His plan for this transition was to move the Indians of the West into one or two large reservations, leaving the land outside these reservations open for white settlement. Indians outside the reservation boundaries would be fair game to be attacked by the military at any time. The long-term goal, Walker explained, was to help the Native American people assimilate. He pictured the giant reservation as a place where Indians would have to work, learn industrial skills, attend school, and generally do as they were told. A program of education and work would turn the former wanderers into settled laborers. So again, this narrative that they're just wanderers, they go where the food is and they're starving most of the time, doesn't seem to be the strong sort of Egyptian god or pharaoh, right, that you picture a chief, maybe older, right, but those younger chiefs in the making, I don't know, what are they called? Princes and princesses? I think so. I think so. And the very nature of that narrative, it seems they've been stripped of in order to promote this other narrative and engineer them socially. But yeah, weren't they called prince and princesses? No queens and kings. There was a chief and there were prince and princesses, it seems. Trained and reformed on the reservation, the Indians would be prepared to enter civilized society. Again, social engineering. And we know this is social engineering through genes is eugenics. Social engineering through psychology or forced physicality, right? Either by walking, either by labor, right? Forced physicality is bad news, is social engineering. Physical engineering through genetics, social engineering through the mind and the body and the spirit. The Dawes Act. Other white reformers had a different solution to the question of what to do with Indians. In their view, reservations only kept Native Americans apart from the rest of society and delayed their assimilation. This view became official policy in 1887 when Congress passed the Dawes Act. You can look up more details about that because we did talk about that in detail in one of our Bookless classrooms, in the Bookless classroom. The Dawes Act reversed Walker's peace policy. It was designed to break up the reservations that already existed and to turn Indians into individual property owners and U.S. citizens. Reservation lands belonged to tribes, not to individuals, but the Dawes Act gave the president the power, without tribal consent, to give land to individual families in plots of up to 160 acres. These parcels were called allotments. Any surplus reservation land that was left after individuals had received their allotment could be sold by the government to white settlers. So visualize this, right? What you have going on is I have 160 acres for one family. What am I going to do with the 160 acres? And my next partner is that far away. And so I'm not going to be able to use up all the land. So there will be white settlers surrounding me. Profits from these sales would go toward educating the Indians who would become U.S. citizens when they accepted their allotments. Senator Henry Dawes, the author of the act, believed that for the Indians to be civilized, the tribal system must be destroyed. And you even get these sort of mental pictures of tribal. When you're tribal, you're savage. So tribal living is analogous to savagery, according to what Senator Henry Dawes is saying. Owning communal land led to savage habits and laziness. By creating private property holders, the allotment system would make Indians independent and self-reliant. Selling, of course, but they wanted tribal community living, right? They didn't want your capitalism. Selling the surplus reservation land to whites would help the Indians too. Native American farmers would learn good work habits from the white farmers who would be their neighbors. It would seem like that, it was the exact opposite. White farmers were learning the habits from the Indians and then stealing their property once the work was done. Seems like this is level 2 of the same concept, of the same lazy concept. The Dawes Act gave Indians what they already owned, their land, but it also took land away from them. White farmers and business interests were well aware of the economic advantages they stood to gain from the allotment program. In 1880, Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz predicted that the allotments would eventually open to settlement by white men the large tracts of land now belonging to the reservation, but not used by the Indians. Railroad companies also benefited from the policy of breaking up reservations. In 1886 to 1887, Congress made 6 land grants to railroad interests, giving them the right to build railways through Indian land and to claim property along the railway lines. During the next 2 sessions of Congress, the nation's lawmakers granted another 23 railroad rights of way through Indian territories. Land changes hands. 4 years after the Dawes Act became law, Indian Commissioner Thomas Morgan calculated that the year 1891 alone, and in the year 1891 alone, 1/7 of all Indian lands were sold to non-Indians. While Morgan admitted that this might look like a rapid loss of land, he explained that the Indians had hardly used it and did not need it. Sounds like the artifacts now, right? In 1902, Congress passed a new law that sped up the transfer of land from Indians to whites. The law said that when the Indian owner of a land allotment died, the property could not be left to the owner's heirs, but had to be sold at open auction. Unless the heirs were able to buy their own family land, they would lose it. A government official assured President Theodore Roosevelt that under this system it will be but a few years at most before Indians' land will have passed into the possession of the settlers. And remember, they came to him in Washington, D.C. while he was sitting at his dinner, and he kind of pshawed them. Maybe this is where I read it. Hold on. There's more. So this does not give you a good positive picture of Theodore Roosevelt. Native Americans resisted these efforts to take their lands away. Chief Lone Wolf of Kiowa, for example, insisted in court that an 1868 treaty required that all deals involving tribal land must be approved by the whole tribe. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against him, saying that the federal government had the power to charge or cancel the provisions of an Indian treaty. This decision allowed the government to dispose of Indians' land without their permission. Once Indian affairs... So what does it matter if you have a treaty? Clearly it doesn't matter. Contract, no comprendo. Or how about treaty, no comprendo. We use contracts. One Indian Affairs official greeted the decision with relief, saying that without the Supreme Court, it might have taken as long as 50 years to get rid of the reservations and free up the land for white farmers. And 1933, so this is just clearly planned, right? And this is Indian Affairs, by the way. So they're supposed to be on the side of Indians. Indian Affairs greeted the decision with relief, saying that without the Supreme Court, It might have taken as long as 50 years to get rid of the reservations and free up the land for white farmers. By 1933, the Native American peoples of the United States had lost about 60% of the 138 million acres they had owned at the time of the Dawes Act. The policy of allotment had been turning the Indians into a landless people. A change in direction. The allotment program was halted suddenly in 1934 by a new law, 1934, by a new law called the Indian Reorganization Act. This act was the creation of John Collier, who had been named Commissioner of the Indian Affairs by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Collier admired the sense of community he found among the Native American people, as I do, of New Mexico. He declared that only the Indians still knew the secret of building character through communal life. I've said it as well. Collier wanted to let Indians remain Indians and allow them to enter modern life without giving up their heritage and culture. If the Indian life is a good life, he wrote, then we should be proud and glad to have this different and native culture going on by the side of ours. In Collier's view, allotment and destroying the Indian communal way of life, in Collier's view, allotment was destroying the Indian communal way of life. His Indian Reorganization Act represented a complete change in direction from the Dawes Act. It not only ended the allotment program, but also authorized the use of federal funds for tribes to buy land and establish their own local governments. This reorganization, though, would apply only to tribes in which a majority of members voted to accept it. No tribe would be forced to reorganize. Collier felt that letting the tribes choose whether or not to change from one system to the other was a way of giving Indians some say in their destiny. A year after the new law went into effect, 172 tribes with a total of 132,426 members voted to accept reorganization. Another 73 tribes with a total of 63,467 voted not to be included in the reorganization. The Navajo's Long Walk. The Navajo of the Southwest were one of the tribes that turned down the offer of reorganization. To them, Collier represented a long tradition of white people telling Indians what was in their best interest. The Navajo remembered decisions that whites had made for them in the 1860s. For several centuries, ever since they acquired sheep from the Spanish, the Navajo had been herders. After the United States won the Southwest in the war against Mexico, whites began intruding on Navajo lands. Conflict followed. In 1863, the Navajo surrendered to an Army scout named Christopher Kit Carson after his troops destroyed their orchards and sheep herds. The Indians were rounded up and marched to a reservation called Bosque Redondo. They called this event the Long Walk. 5 years later, the government moved the Navajo again to a reservation in their original homeland. The Indians also received sheep to replace the livestock Carson's forces had destroyed. Now in the 1930s, the Navajo were getting instructions not from a soldier like Carson, but from a government administrator. Although Collier wanted to give the Indians self-rule, he was also trying to socially engineer their world. He even called it an ethnic laboratory. The Navajos rejected his reorganization plan because they did not want an outside guardian telling them what was best for them. The reorganization vote was only one of Collier's interactions with the Navajo. In 1933, he decided that the Navajo owned 500,000 more livestock than their reservation could support. Overgrazing by their sheep and goats, he claimed, was causing severe soil erosion. Unless the problem of erosion was solved, and soon the sheep raising Navajo would experience great hardship and suffering. Collier was worried about Navajo survival, but he was also worried about white interests. He had received reports that silt from erosion on Navajo land was filling the Colorado River and threatening to clog Boulder Dam, now called Hoover Dam, a huge hydroelectric project that was being built to supply water to California's agricultural heartland and to provide electricity for Los Angeles. So here, using their farming ways to provide this kind of agriculture to whites, stealing their land after they had taught them and actually done all the work, and then providing services for other white people. Now, it's not, this is the story here. This is how these people were identified. They could be identified as the offspring of colonists, right? They weren't all white. Clearly, they weren't all white, right? It's the experience that these people have had and a way to identify their oppressor. The United States Geological Survey identified the Navajo Reservation as the chief cause of the Colorado silt problem. The solution Collier decided was to reduce Navajo stock by 400,000 animals. Over a 5-year period, he flew to the reservation 17 times to explain and promote the stock reduction program, but the Navajo did not accept it. In my long life of social effort and struggle, Collier later wrote, I have not experienced among any other Indian group or any group whatsoever an anxiety-ridden and anguished hostility, even approaching that which the Navajo were undergoing. To the left here, we've got the federal government and the Navajo clashed over the issue of sheep, which had long been central to Navajo life. And by the way, they really were experts in being able to farm, right? Without destroying the planet. And it was probably in their weather engineering where we saw some really hard times emerge. Erosion. For the Navajo, sheep and survival. For the Navajo, sheep and survival were the same. Raising, and who are you to come into my lifestyle and tell me not to raise my sheep? Raising sheep was their way of life. Boys grew up caring for the flocks, and herding represented the closeness of the family and the passing of values from one generation to the next. Reducing their herds, and it's a job that a young kid could do because they got to keep the foxes away. They have to stay awake. They could study for school, right? They could study during this time, especially as they have a trainer helping them be a shepherd, to start out as a shepherd. Boys grew up caring for the flocks, and herding represented the closeness of the family and passing of values from one generation to the next. Reducing their herds went against everything they believed, everything they had learned from years of living on their land. And, by the way, providing that area for food, meat, lamb, for other tribes who in their area were bead making or lace making or corn growing or teaching, right? But Collier carried out his program to remove livestock in order to stop erosion. Agents removed sheep and goats while the Navajo wondered how they would live without their stock. After his sheep had been taken away, see Early Birds and our story of David and Bathsheba and the story of Nathan the prophet. After his sheep had been taken away, one herder cursed the officials. You people are indeed heartless. You have now killed me. You have cut off my arms. You have cut off my legs. You have taken my head off. There is nothing left for me. This is the end of the trail. Meanwhile, the Navajo found themselves increasingly living on wages, mostly from temporary government employment. The stock reduction program had reduced many Navajo to dependency on the federal government. To the Indians, Collier's talking about wrapping a people in a narrative. To the Indians, Collier's project was the most devastating experience in their tribal history since the Long Walk. Tragically, the stock reduction program was not even necessary to control erosion. Talk about just getting right to the heart of injustice, right? Making sure people are fully enraged by your injustice. What else did they say wasn't even necessary that we said? It was, union. We were talking about union in the Bookless classroom. They gave them the wages. After all the torment, they gave them the raise. Here, same difference. After more research on soil erosion, imagine that, the scientists would discover that overgrazing was not the source of the problem. You mean, and now we have all their land? The Navajo had known that all along and had tried in vain to tell the government. They knew that erosion had occurred many times in the past. It was part of a years-long cycle of dry weather, erosion, rainfall, and recovery. The problems of erosion and silt had more to do with the drought than with the number of Navajo livestock. And who was controlling the weather patterns with those planes? In the 1930s had brought years of little rain. The Indians predicted that the dry rangelands would be covered with fresh new grass when the drought ended. But by that time, sadly, the herds and their way of life would be eroding along with the soil. Now we get to the story. The Last Arrow pageants were events that the federal government organized to symbolize the Native Americans' shift from their old way of life to a new life as landowners and farmers. An article from the Gettysburg Times of January 5th, 1917 describes how the Department of the Interior held these ceremonies to modernize the race of Indians. The Indians who are to be honored with the confidence of the government are selected by a competency commission of 3 men who go through a reservation from house to house, reporting on the progress of each family, the condition of the house and form, the way the children are cared for, and their general economic status. The Indians selected are invited to a public meeting. There are representatives of the Department of the Interior a representative of the Department of the Interior tells them very solemnly that the president has heard that they are ready to leave the control of the Indian Bureau and become free American citizens. He then calls the English name of the first man on his list, James Robinson, it may be, whose Indian name perhaps was Rain in the Face. The official hands him a bow and arrow, telling him to shoot the arrow. The Indian complies. As the arrow strikes the ground, the representative of the government says, "Rain in the Face, you have shot your last arrow." That means that you are no longer to live in the life of an Indian. You are, from this day forward, to live the life of a white man. But you may keep that arrow. It will be... I want you to know I'm reading this as a quote. It will be to you a symbol of your noble race and of the pride you feel that you come from the first of all Americans. James Robinson, take in your hand this plow. How about that? Is that the saddest ceremony you can imagine? A forced ceremony, as if to ridicule their entire way of existence in one final ceremony. Wah, wah. This is from the Gettysburg Times. I don't see the author, but it does say that this was organized by the federal government. So that's what that says, organized by the federal government. The government official then told the Indian that the plow represented work. Another gift, a purse, represented savings, and the official urged the Indian to work hard and use his earnings wisely. The third gift, a flag, represented American citizenship. The general effect of the ceremonial has proved most happy, says the final sentence of the article, and the honor of participating in it has served as a stimulus to many of the Indians to work harder for the privileges of citizenship. Nowhere does the article say what the Indians themselves thought about this ceremony or the way it required them to give up the names and customs of their people and their arrows, which goes back to seeing their own lame deer, seeing his own arrow in a museum. That was symbolizing or preserving the history of this ceremony. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We have finished chapter 9 in our book, A Different Mirror for Young People by Ronald Takaki. We will start chapter 10 tomorrow as we are rolling with our 3 days on. It is August 26th. We have just completed day 237 with chapter 9, chapter 10, the Japanese and money trees. Oh, let me see. I want to see where because I read this. Oh, I made notes in this as well. And that chapter, that's a long, this is coming up. It will be, is kind of a long chapter. Then chapter 11, Jews are pushed from Russia. I read that. And then up from Mexico is where I have notes beyond that too. All right, chapter 10. Thanks for joining me here. Joining Dr. Annette Feravich, where we are exploring different ways, or the same ways, of keeping your mind, your body, and your spirit healthy. Thank you again for joining me here.